The Glagan hegemony considered itself the most sophisticated civilization in the Orion Arm. They were not beings of flesh and blood in the common galactic sense, but immense, sentient, sessile organisms, more akin to colossal, motile fungi or strange, mobile flora than to fauna. Each Glagan was a walking ecosystem, a complex network of hyphae, fruiting bodies, and specialized organs that pulsed with internal bioluminescence. Their communication, the very bedrock of their intricate society, was entirely pheromonal. Complex chains of airborne organic molecules released from specialized glands conveyed vast amounts of data, emotions, complex ideologies, technical schematics, with a nuance and directness that made vocal speech seem laughably crude. To the Glagan, humanity was amusing. They called them the noisy apes. Humans with their flailing limbs, their reliance on vibrating air, speech, and their strange, inefficient symbols, writing, were seen as primitive. Their sounds were jarring, their social interactions chaotic. The Glagan overseer plenipotentiary for uncontacted primitives, a towering entity named Bloom of Many Spores, often mused via its subtle scent emissions that humans were like excitable children, loud and messy, desperately in need of proper, silent guidance. The human colony on Veridia Prime was a jewel. Terraformed with care, it was a world of rolling green hills, carefully cultivated fields, and small, thoughtfully designed settlements. The air was clean, the water pure. Its 20 million inhabitants lived in relative peace, their days filled with work, family, and the quiet hum of a developing world. They talked, they argued, they laughed, their voices carrying on the breeze, a cacophony that would have driven a Glagan to sensory shutdown. Bloom of Many Spores, observing Veridia Prime from its bioship, a vessel that resembled a colossal, spacefaring seed pod, decided it was time for intervention. The noisy apes, for all their primitiveness, showed potential. If only their chaotic energies could be harmonized. The hegemony had a standard protocol for such upliftings, a gentle, pervasive atmospheric infusion of educational pheromones. These molecules were designed to subtly guide primitive minds towards Glagan ideals of collective harmony, efficient resource management, and silent, orderly contemplation. Commence Phase 1. Atmospheric harmonization, Bloom of Many Spores exuded. It sent a complex blend of benevolent paternalism and unwavering conviction. From the underside of the Glagan bioships, almost invisible vents released a fine, colorless, odorless mist. It was the gift of understanding, as the Glagan called it. The mist, composed of complex macromolecules, drifted down into Veridia Prime's atmosphere, carried by the winds, settling over farms, towns, and cities. On Veridia Prime, the first signs were subtle. A farmer, Jedediah Hicks, standing in his field of xenocorn, suddenly felt a strange sense of listlessness. The vibrant colors of his crops seemed less important. His desire to haggle with the grain merchant at the market that afternoon faded, replaced by a vague urge to simply stand still and absorb. In the capital city, Nova Terra, office workers reported sudden headaches, a peculiar mental fog. Children in schools became unusually quiet, their usual boisterous energy replaced by a placid docility. Arguments ceased. Laughter died down. People moved slower, their faces showing a new, shared expression of mild confusion and compliance. They weren't learning complex Glagan philosophy. They were just feeling off, unwell. Dr. Aris Thorne, chief of the Veridia Prime Xenobiological Studies Institute, frowned at the latest reports. Mass lethargy, mild nausea, and a strange cognitive dullness were being reported colony-wide. His first thought was a new strain of pollen, or perhaps a foodborne contaminant, but the symptoms were too widespread, too uniform. It's like a wave of depression is hitting the whole planet, his assistant, Lena Hansen, a sharp-witted biochemist, commented, rubbing her own temples. I've felt a bit fuzzy myself all morning. The colonial government, initially slow to react, declared a state of medical emergency when production across the planet dropped by 40% in 2 days. People weren't dying, but they were becoming passive. The gift of understanding was being interpreted as a creeping sickness. Lena Hansen, working late in a lab, ran atmospheric samples through her most sensitive mass spectrometer. The standard pollutant checks came back negative, but there was something else. A complex series of organic compounds she'd never seen before, with incredibly intricate molecular structures. Aris, she called, her voice urgent, overriding the general lethargy she also felt. You need to see this. These aren't natural compounds. They're too designed, and the concentrations are increasing. As they studied the molecules, another scientist in the institute, Dr. Kenji Tanaka, a specialist in animal communication, looked at the complex chains. They remind me of insect pheromones, he mused, but orders of magnitude more complex, like a language. That was when the penny dropped. The Glargan ships, hitherto unnoticed in high orbit due to their biological camouflage, were finally detected by a deep space military radar on a nearby moonbase, which then relayed the information. The connection was immediate and terrifying. The aliens weren't just observing, they were doing something to their atmosphere, and that something was making everyone sick and dull. The uplift was perceived as a biological attack. Panic, muted by the pheromones but still present, began to filter through the human leadership. They tried hailing the Glargan ships. The Glargan, receiving only blasts of electromagnetic noise, radio waves, dismissed it as more primitive cacophony, confirming their assessment of human backwardness. They continued the atmospheric harmonization, confident in its benevolent purpose. On Veridia Prime, Lena Hansen and her team worked feverishly. They managed to isolate several of the key pheromonal compounds. They were not toxins in the traditional sense. They seemed to be subtly altering human neurochemistry, dampening certain emotional responses, encouraging passivity. They're not trying to kill us, Lena realized, a cold dread filling her. They're trying to change us, control us. The instructional intent was completely lost, overshadowed by the non-consensual alteration of their minds. The Glargan believed they were offering enlightenment. The humans believed they were being pacified, their minds slowly stolen. The turning point came when Lena, analyzing the Glargan pheromones, recognized repeating structural motifs, variations on core molecular themes. This isn't just a random cocktail of chemicals, she explained to Dr. Thorne and the Emergency Council. This is structured. It has patterns, like sentences. What if this is how they talk? The idea was staggering. A species whose very language was a biochemical agent capable of directly influencing the minds of other species. It was horrifying. It was also, to minds like Lena's, a fascinating challenge. If it's a language, Thorne said slowly, the implications dawning on him, can we understand it? More importantly, can we block it? They didn't have time to learn the Glargan language, but blocking it, Lena's eyes lit up. Receptor antagonists, she breathed. If we can identify the neural receptors these pheromones are binding to, we can design molecules to block them, an antidote. For weeks they worked. Scientists, engineers, chemists, all fighting the encroaching mental fog with stimulants and sheer willpower. They synthesized and tested hundreds of compounds. Finally, they had a breakthrough. A molecule that, when inhaled, effectively shielded human neural receptors from the Glargan pheromones. An aerosolized version was rapidly produced and distributed. As the antidote spread, Veridia Prime began to wake up. The fog lifted. Confusion gave way to fear, and then to a cold, hard anger. They had been invaded, not by soldiers, but by an insidious chemical manipulation of their very minds. But Lena Hansen didn't stop at an antidote. The scientist in her, the human in her, was incensed. The sheer arrogance of the Glargan, to think they could just rewrite another species' minds. Their language is a weapon, she said to Thorne, her voice tight. They used it on us. What if we could speak back, in a way they'll understand? Thorne looked at her, understanding her implication. You mean weaponize their own biology against them? They understand chemicals, not words, Lena stated. We need to send them a message they can't ignore. This was humanity's abstract analytical power clicking into high gear. They didn't just want to defend. They wanted to demonstrate unequivocally that they were not to be trifled with. Lena's team began a new project, not just to block the Glargan pheromones, but to understand their fundamental structure. How did the Glargan express concepts like danger, or pain, or fear through chemistry? They couldn't know for sure, as they had no Rosetta Stone for Glargan emotions. But they could make educated guesses based on the underlying biochemistry of stress and aversion. They began to synthesize new compounds, antipheromones, as they started calling them. Molecules designed not to instruct or soothe, but to disrupt, to cause distress. Their first creation was a molecule predicted to induce intense olfactory offense, based on decomposition analogues, something universally repulsive. Their second was more ambitious, a neurochemical scrambler designed to interfere with the Glargan's own pheromonal perception, effectively creating sensory static, or even phantom, terrifying signals from their own kind. Their third was designed to mimic a Glargan distress signal, but amplified, distorted, and laced with chemical markers of acute biological crisis. They didn't know precisely what these would do, but they knew they wouldn't be pleasant. The delivery system was crude but effective. Modified agricultural sprayer drones, loaded with canisters of the concentrated antipheromones, launched towards the Glargan bioships. Aboard Bloom of Many Spores vessel, the atmosphere was one of serene confidence. The instructional pheromones were reaching optimal concentration. Soon, the noisy apes would be calm, receptive, ready for true enlightenment. Then, the human drones, too small to be considered military threats by Glargan automated defenses, reached the bioships. They didn't carry explosives. They simply sprayed their chemical payloads onto the porous outer membranes of the Glargan vessels, membranes designed to absorb and process atmospheric molecules. The effect on the Glargan was instantaneous and catastrophic. Bloom of Many Spores was in mid-exudation of a complex thought regarding the beauty of silent communion when an utterly alien, horrifyingly foul odor flooded its sensory chambers. It was a scent of unimaginable decay and wrongness, a chemical scream that bypassed all filters. Panic, an emotion so primitive the Glargan barely had a specific pheromone for it, erupted through its being. Then came the sensory static. The delicate flow of pheromonal communication between the Glargan on the ship dissolved into a cacophony of meaningless, jarring signals. It was as if 1,000 voices were shouting gibberish directly into their minds, while also inducing a profound sense of disorientation and nausea. Crew members, if the distinct bioluminescent clusters within the ship could be called that, began to emit their own panicked, confused pheromones, adding to the chaos. Then the distorted distress signal hit. This was the worst. It was like a fundamental corruption of their very being. Their own internal systems felt like they were screaming in terror. Their pheromone-emitting organs pulsed erratically, emitting sense of dread and system failure. It felt, to the Glargan, as if their own bodies were betraying them, as if their own language had become a poison. Bloom of Many Spores had never experienced anything like it. This wasn't communication. This was assault, a chemical violation of their most fundamental sense. The noisy apes, how could they? How could such primitive beings, who relied on crude vibrations in the air, possibly understand, let alone manipulate, the sacred language of scent to such a devastating extent? The hegemony ships, moments before serene islands of calm, became hives of utter pandemonium. Logical thought collapsed. Their hierarchical social structure, built on subtle pheromonal cues, fractured. There was only a desperate, primal urge to flee. Retreat, evacuate, severe biochemical contamination. Bloom of Many Spores managed to exude in a ragged, desperate burst, its own scent thick with terror and disbelief. The Glargan bioships, with clumsy, panicked haste, turned and fled the Viridia Prime system, their sophisticated FTL drives engaging almost randomly, desperate to escape the horrifying, invisible miasma. They didn't understand what had happened, only that the atmosphere around the human planet had become a chemical hell. On Viridia Prime, the humans watched in stunned silence as the massive Glargan ships vanished. They had expected a battle, perhaps a negotiation. Not this utter, terrified rout. What did we do to them? Dr. Thorne asked, looking at Lena, who was monitoring the rapidly diminishing Glargan energy signatures. Lena was pale, but her eyes held a grim light. I think, she said slowly, we spoke to them in a language they couldn't ignore. We showed them that our noise has teeth. We analyzed their method of control, and we turned it back on them magnified. The Glargan hegemony retreated back to its core worlds, shaken to its very fungal roots. An emergency council was convened. The data from Veridia Prime was analyzed, again and again. The conclusion was terrifying. The noisy apes, the primitives, possessed an abstract analytical capability that was utterly alien and horrifying. They had taken the Glargan's most sacred, most complex art, their pheromonal language, and in a matter of weeks had not only deciphered its fundamental principles, but had weaponized it with terrifying efficiency. Their own language, their very essence, had been turned against them. What if human vocal language, those strange, symbolic noises, was merely a precursor, a training ground for this kind of abstract, analytical, biochemical warfare? What if humans could learn to speak death into the very air other species breathed? The Glargan hegemony immediately quarantined the entire sector of space containing humanity. They issued internal directives classifying human symbolic communication as a level Omega memetic hazard. All Glargan vessels were ordered to avoid human-settled space at all costs. Humanity, for its part, was mostly relieved and a little bewildered by the Glargan's extreme reaction. They had defended themselves, yes, but the sheer terror they had apparently inflicted was unexpected. News of the Veridia incident slowly spread through the galactic grapevine. The Glargan, known for their quiet arrogance and sophisticated control, were now seen as having a bizarre, almost pathological fear of humans. A new legend was born. Humanity, the species that could listen to your soul by smelling the air and then turn your own words into a nightmare. The noisy apes were noisy indeed, and their silence, when they chose it, was now more terrifying to some than any shouted threat. They weren't just chaotic. They were terrifyingly, unpredictably, analytically brilliant, and they would not be uplifted.